So I've been a firefighter for 30 years now. These days now I work as a senior position in the regular fire service, but in my youth I was based out near Yoho National Forest and fought fires for the Canadian Forest Service. Now I signed on for 2 years back in '77 purely for a change of scenery and a new challenge, and I liked it so much out there that I extended my stay until summer's end in 1980. They call that region the Kootenays, and while they're covered in snow from November until March and damp as hell almost all other times, the summers out there get really, really hot some years. All the pine needles dry out and become crisp and kindling, and the cones expand too, pushing out all that flammable sap that makes them all sticky. And then all it takes is one little spark, and the whole damn forest is in jeopardy. Now, I've been on a couple of attack crews by the summer of '79, meaning I've had plenty of experience humping hose packs and fire axes up ridges, and I've done plenty of learning from the old-timers who'd probably breathed more ash than most smokers. We were based in this little town called Field, British Columbia, inside the Kicking Horse River Valley, and while sometimes we could get kind of samey in a town with less than 200 people in it, it sure was beautiful. We were surrounded by endless pine forests and snow-peaked mountains. I mean, you couldn't move for picturesque. But in the high summer and the deep winter, Mother Nature could be a real bitch when she wanted to. And it was no different in the summer of '79 when a freak lightning storm hit the forest. We've been watching the pressure gauge rise for a couple of days already, so it didn't take us completely by surprise. But when a storm finally broke, it wasn't what we were expecting at all. Instead of a downpour with a few infrequent strikes, we got a bout of what we call dry lightning. Now, dry lightning occurs only at the hottest part of the summer because what most often causes it is weather so warm that it literally evaporates what little rain falls from the storm clouds. Then, couple this with an unusually large number of strikes at a time when the entire forest was little more than a giant tinderbox, and you had a recipe for disaster. Mother Nature's fury was on full display that afternoon, as bolt after bolt hit the dry forest. They send sparks into the air when they get hit, then burn from the inside out. Not that I saw any strikes that day, I was too far away. We soon got the call, and we were soon prepping to move. There was just one problem. The storm had fried the park warden's radios, meaning that there was no talking with anyone except their HQ in Banff. Now, I was told the wind and static was so bad that all the relays had either been knocked down or fried, but since we had a tower of our own, we were able to get up there and take a look around for smoke. I prayed we'd get lucky, but I guess God wasn't looking our way that day because before long, we saw one and then 2 stacks of smoke coming up, one near Emerald Lake and then another over by the Burgess Shale side. And by the time the evac and firefighting plan had been put together, we had reports of 3 new fires, making a total of 5. And then with the strong winds, the risk of spot fires sparking all around the strikes was scarily high considering the sheer number of cases we were dealing with. All in all, the park was lighting up like a freaking Christmas tree, and then since we were prepped, all we had to do was sit tight and wait for orders. The boss had turned the map room into a kind of conference center, and in coordination with the guys over in Banff, we were trying to figure out exactly where the strikes had occurred so we could best place our people. He was chain smoking, cussing up a storm in there, and then suddenly, we were finally needed. He called us into the room, pointed to a spot on his map out near the Otter Tail, and told us that there was a fire lookout there that needed evac. Based on where the strikes had hit, 2 separate fires had the chance to link up and cut the lookout off. And then if it burned through the whole area, then, well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you what had happened to the poor SOB stationed there. Once the briefing was completed, our heli pilot gave me the nod. And then after loading up a couple of extra canteens and some first aid and a small blanket just in case, we lifted off with these thumping rotors and headed over to the Otter Tail. Flying over the low valleys, we could see the smoke rising in the distance, these ragged white plumes that turned darker as the trees started to burn. Even as we soared through the air at God knows what speed, the air started to smell like ozone and burnt pitch. The storm wasn't done yet either, and we saw a couple of strikes hit on the way in. But after cresting a ridge, we suddenly saw the tower, standing tall against a backdrop of dark clouds. We circled around before the pilot took the bird down on a strip of flat about 100 yards away from the tower. I honestly figured whoever was in the lookout would be out there waiting for us because a chopper ain't exactly quiet, you know. But it wasn't until we were walking up on the thing that a guy stepped out onto the catwalk. Now, he was still buttoning up his shirt as he came down the stairs, and we told him it was time to move. But rather than shift his ass into gear and grab whatever he needed from his tower or cabin, the guy acted almost confused. He'd obviously heard the lightning strikes but hadn't seen the smoke trails. But then the strangest thing was how he didn't seem to know the radios had been fried. I remember one of my team asking him, "Haven't you checked your radio recently?" To which the lookout indignantly replied, "I was taking a nap. Have you tried sleeping out here in the summer without AC?" He made a fair point, I guess. It was hot as hell during that summer. Then rather than argue with little stuff, we just told the guy that we were there to evacuate him and that we needed to get moving ASAP. But then, and this stopped me dead in my tracks, he asked us, "Where are you taking me?" And the response was kind of obvious, and the guy who asked him if he was good to go told him, "Regional headquarters and field. Where the hell else would we take you?" And the lookout suggested that we might take him to a hospital to get looked over, but since there was nothing wrong with him, that was never our intention. But again, we were getting held up on small details instead of doing the thing that we needed to do, and so I personally asked if he needed to collect anything from the tower or cabin. But this question seemed to get the strangest reaction of all. Instead of saying, "Oh sure, I'll go grab my stuff," he said that he didn't need anything, to which all three of us were like, "You were staying here for weeks and weeks, but you didn't bring anything remotely precious with you?" But no. The guy had no pictures of family, no old books or journals, no musical instruments, nothing. And I'm telling you, almost half of all fire lookouts take a guitar or banjo up there, thinking that they're going to head up there an amateur and finish the season playing like Alex Lifeson. But not only did our guy have nothing worth taking with him, but he did not seem excited on the idea of us entering the lookout tower. I personally asked him if he wanted me to run up and grab anything to save on time, and he just is like, No, really. It's a mess up there. You don't have to." It didn't matter to me. We were going for speed after all, but then I mentioned how Raj, the assistant chief, would be pissed if we didn't get him back safe and sound. But that's when the guy said something like, Yeah, Roger's got a real temper on him, huh?" Now, it was only me who heard it, and I guess this requires a little explanation on my part, and so here goes. Now, the assistant chief warden at the time was this Sikh guy named Rajesh, or Raj for short. But the lookout said Roger, as in Roger Rabbit. And this had me asking, who the hell is Roger? And right away I could smell bullcrap because I watched him come up with an answer right there in front of me like, Roger's the guy I talked to when I started. But he clearly just misheard me and was now thinking on his feet, at which point I'm thinking, why lie? Now we're just kind of standing around doing nothing by then, and I remember our chopper pilot calling out, "Come on, let's go already." But then as we're walking back towards the landing zone with the chopper's rotors starting up again, my suspicions about our lookout boiled over. Now he didn't want us entering the lookout. He didn't know Raj, who I knew for a fact interviewed all the civilian lookouts, and he didn't seem to know that the Parkside operation was based in field either. At which point I'm asking myself, who the hell is this guy? And so before we loaded up, and purely for my own peace of mind, I asked the guys to hold tight, saying that I dropped something near the tower and that I just needed to grab it before we left. Now immediately our lookout starts looking shifty, to the point that I'm actually saying to him, "Hey, don't worry, buddy. I'm not going in the tower. You can relax." And you know something? He did. He did relax. Well, sort of anyway, and that he went from looking like he was about to chase me down and tackle me to looking like he was content to stay put. But then, the second he realized I lied to him and my foot hit the first step on the way up the tower, I heard, and so loud I heard it over the chopper's engine.
"Hey, wait!"
From one of my team. I turned to see our lookout sprinting away from the chopper and towards the tree line. My teammates looked confused to the point of being scared, but I knew exactly why he was running. There was something in the watchtower he really didn't want us to see. And while I all but expected it by the time I opened the door of the little cabin atop that watchtower, it didn't make seeing it any easier. Stuffed under the bed, completely naked, and with some kind of cloth or rag shoved in her mouth, was the actual fire lookout, a lady named Jean. And I'm pretty sure that even without that thing in her mouth, she wouldn't have been able to make a sound. She'd been beaten and violated for days by the time we found her, and her level of dehydration alone had her on death's door. She had cracked ribs, broken teeth, all kinds of internal bleeding and bruising, and her face was so beat up that I couldn't even recognize her when next we met and all the swelling had finally gone down. It was lucky that we had the chopper ready to go too, because I'm honestly not sure that she'd have survived if we'd waited for a vehicle to get up there. And trying to carry her would have been a death sentence too, on account of how torn up she was on the inside, I'm sad to say. It was kind of crazy to think about. It was like that lightning storm saved her life. Jean said the man had caught her while she was out on a walk and had been keeping her prisoner at knife point for days after smashing up her radio. But all the while, the atmospheric pressure rising and rising until the sky started cooking up that incredible display of power it showed us. It was like God was furious and told us to do something about it. And while I guess we did it all completely on accident, we ended up scaring the guy off. To me, and aside from all the evil crap he did to her, the worst thing about the guy was how he was happy to let the fire sweep over the area and let it roast that poor girl alive up there. When we asked him if there was anything important up there and he said no, he was talking about a human being, a human life. And of all the reason it sucks that the cops never caught the guy, that's the one which gets to me the most. Okay, for reference, I'm a 58-year-old woman, but I was 27 during the events I'm about to write about. I hate when people don't make that clear at the start of their story, so I'm leaving this here so everything's easy to picture. Now anyway, I was 27 at the time, and it was the spring of 1994, and my whole life had basically fallen apart. To escape a relationship that turned physically abusive, I had to leave Seattle, and that meant abandoning my waitressing job in the community college that I was attending. I've been living in Seattle for 6 years at that point, and I loved it there. So leaving it behind, along with all the friends and memories I'd made there, was incredibly upsetting, but I knew I had no choice. If I stayed, that guy would have killed me, and that's no exaggeration. I grew up in western Montana, and that's where my mom was still living at the time, so that's where I fled. It was a bittersweet homecoming. Sweet because I hadn't seen Mom in almost a year by that time when I called her, and bitter because I'd returned a failure in my mind. I spent a few days lying in my old bedroom feeling sorry for myself, with Mom bringing me trays of chicken noodle soup like I was some sick kid again. When I was on my feet again, I helped her in the kitchen, we walked our dog together, and then we watched the Golden Girls together until bed. It was great to get to hang out with her, but it was the walks through the bitter roots that somehow proved the best medicine. Seattle's a green city, but it's a city nevertheless, so I guess being back in the country did things for my soul that I never even knew that I needed. Now, while I was home, I arranged to meet up with an old high school friend that I hadn't seen in almost a decade. Mom mentioned that she was around, so I gave her a call, and we met for some beers one night. It turns out she was working for the Forest Service as part of a trail crew, and when she told me, I felt this instant flash of, well, let's call it friendly envy. Listening to her talk about working the trails had me hanging on to her every word, and at the time, I remember thinking it sounded like the coolest job ever. And then when I mentioned being super jealous, she told me about a vacancy that she knew up at Lolo National Forest. Now, long story short, the Forest Service was having trouble keeping this one fire lookout staffed for the summer, and this was in part due to the fact that it was so isolated. There were two ways to get to the log cabin and watchtower that comprised the lookout. It was helicopter or pack mule. And I guess the reality of living up there in seclusion for an extended period gave people a bad case of the willies because, while trying to get it staffed that year, the Park Service had 3 different people cancel on them. I mean, I get it. The idea of living on the ass end of nowhere for 3 months with nothing but a radio, a propane fridge, and their own thoughts, I appreciate that's not most people's idea of a summer well spent. But at the time, I was already disappearing into the woods for hours at a time with a backpack, a book, and a flask full of coffee, so the idea of actually living up in a lookout tower while being paid to watch for smoke felt less like a job and a whole lot more of that medicine that I mentioned earlier. My high school friends said the fact that I was kind of underqualified wouldn't matter, and the fact that I've been studying forestry in community college would count towards experience, and if I could guarantee I wouldn't back out, she'd put in a good word for me. I told her there was nothing in the world I'd rather do and that I'd be willing to sign up for the full 3-month stint too, especially if it meant walking away with a pile of cash that I could use to get myself back on my feet. And then a week later, I drove over to the district office to speak with a fire management officer. A few weeks later, I got the call that I was headed to Lolo for 3 months. Then, after a couple of training sessions on how to use a radio, the Osborne Firefinder, and how to read smoke columns, I was good to go. Now, the hard part was the helicopter flight up to the mountain in June, and I still remember the way my stomach dropped after we strapped in and took off. It was my first ever helicopter flight, and the one out there was my last, so it was both equally terrifying. But I'll never forget the feeling I got when I spotted the tower and cabin perched on top of that mountaintop. It wasn't much, but to me, it looked like my kingdom for the next 3 months. The pay wasn't anything to write home about, but back then it was $8 an hour plus overtime when fires got going. But I didn't have much in the way of expenses, and honestly, I would have happily paid them for the privilege of being up there and getting away from my old life. Now, I was expected to wake up before dawn, scan the horizon with the binoculars while the coffee was percolating, and then get ready for another day of, well, really nothing. Aside from calling in the weather every hour, I could do whatever I really wanted. And so there'd be these long afternoons where all I really would do was read, write in my journal, and watch the clouds as they passed through what was otherwise a clear blue sky. Some days it was boring enough to drive a person nuts, and I could see why a person needed a certain level of mental fortitude to last even a month up there, doing the same thing over and over, day in and day out. But other days, especially during things like distant lightning storms, it was quite a rush knowing me and the other lookouts were like the tip of the spear when it came to keeping the whole forest from turning to ash. Now, it was a big adjustment at first, even for someone like me who'd grown up in the country, but after 2 weeks, this Brush Mountain lookout started to feel like home. And I say home, but I was obviously still missing a bunch of conveniences and amenities. But being up there was every part as good for me as I figured it would, and rather than boredom, all I felt was peace. At least until one morning when I stepped out of the cabin to find a dead rabbit lying on the ground. Now, it wasn't lying between the cabin and the lookout tower. It wasn't even a few feet away. It was right there outside the door, like it had been placed there deliberately. Now, I went straight to the tower, completed my morning check-in on the radio, then immediately mentioned the rabbit to a forest ranger that I called Hank, but whose real name will remain omitted for reasons that'll become obvious. Lolo's got a lot of predators roaming around. There's black and even grizzly bears, timber wolves that hunt in packs, and mountain lions that hunt alone. They also got things like wolverines, lynx, and bobcats in the high-elevation forests where I was, along with the smaller predators like coyotes, foxes, and various birds of prey. Now, my point is, just about any of these animals might have been walking through the lookout when they stopped at my door, smelled a human, and then fled knowing that they'd be faster if they just dropped their late-night snack. And that's what Hank said anyway, and I didn't need to be an expert for the explanation to make sense to me. And so instead of freaking out and getting all paranoid, I just tossed that rabbit into the brush and hoped that its owner might return later. And exactly 10 days go by, and I know that because I have this all down in my journal, when another dead rabbit appears outside my cabin. Now, when I mentioned it to Hank on the radio, he sounded kind of surprised, and while he made a joke about how I'd been adopted by a mountain lion, he promised to hitch a ride on the next supply run so he could personally take a look around. Now, I can't lie. I kind of like the idea that some mountain lion, in its confusion as to why I was out there, all alone in the middle of nowhere, had decided to try and feed me, like some house cat. But unfortunately, that's not at all what was happening, as Ranger Hank discovered when he came to visit. Now, like I said, he flew in on the resupply helicopter at the end of month 1, and by then, I'd found a total of 4 rabbits outside my cabin, 1 for each week I'd been there. We unloaded the helicopter, which was mostly cases of water, which were heavy as heck, and then once we were done, Hank told the pilot to take 5 while we took a walk around the area. Now, he was looking for animal tracks, and he found plenty, including those of a mountain lion, but after looping around, and as we're walking back to the lookout via the north side, he stops dead in his tracks while looking down at the ground. Right away, this made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up because I literally watched his expression go from carefree to fearful as he's looking at the dirt. And even though the possibility flashed through my mind, hearing him say it was just devastating. Because after kneeling and tracing a finger around the edge of a track I could barely see, he told me it was human. I guess half the reason I couldn't see it at first was because I was looking at a boot print, but after he carefully pointed out where it was and I joined him in kneeling, I started to see it too. It was a footprint, not a boot print, as in it had been caused by someone walking barefoot, not by someone walking in footwear, which, for obvious reasons, made it even more disconcerting. Hank felt it too, at least once I'd confirmed that it wasn't me that had been walking barefoot among the trees. And it was then that talk turned to firearms, or more specifically, how I didn't have one. Now, I had a big can of bear spray with me, and I've been told a firearm wasn't essential since the grizzlies don't start turning really aggressive until fall or very late in the summer at the earliest, at which point I'd be gone. And while bear mace would sure work fine if I hit a person with it, I knew that wasn't enough, and so did Hank, especially not when it came to someone who walked barefoot in the woods and left dead rabbits outside the cabins of lone women. And this is where I tell you why Hank is called Hank here and not his real name, because what he did next was a massive breach of protocol and could have quite easily got him severely reprimanded or even fired. But after asking if I knew how to use one, and quite possibly against his better judgment, he gave me his firearm. Now, I hadn't fired one in about 14 years, but I knew the basics of how to load and fire one, taking a breath, squeezing the trigger, all that stuff. But as he held it out in front of me, I didn't want to take it. Taking it meant accepting that I hadn't been living the life of some Disney princess, being accepted and fed by the local wildlife. It meant a strange man had been walking around the lookout while I slept, probably after spotting and then watching me during daylight hours. Now, it had all these questions whirling around my head like a tornado of panic, asking, how often did he stalk me? Was he close? Was he watching right then? Hank had to bring me back to reality and asked if I was good to go on. Now, he'd happily cover me until they found a replacement, and while it was undeniably an inconvenience, it was considerably preferable to me coming to any harm, but I wouldn't hear of it. I guess I was still sort of in denial or something, because I basically told myself that correlation didn't necessarily equal causation, and just because there was a bare footprint out there didn't mean that it was a person leaving those rabbits. Now, besides, I figured that they wanted to hurt me, they'd have probably tried already, on one of potentially 4 separate visits to that lookout too, and that's assuming it really was a guy leaving the rabbits and not some animal who thought the lookout was a good spot to stash some food. I still took the gun. I'm not completely stupid. I guess I just didn't want to accept the nauseating irony that I'd disappeared into the ass end of nowhere to escape one weird psycho, only to walk right into the hands of another. I mean, it made total sense to me. It was the edge of the Pacific North in the 90s, and of course there was a weird dude stalking lone women and girls in the woods. But at the same time, it seemed so unlikely as to be almost impossible. Now, I didn't fully accept the danger I was in until my gentleman caller made it blindingly and horrifically obvious what his intentions truly were. So, I opened the door of my cabin one morning, and since I'd taken to carrying it everywhere with me, Hank's gun was tucked into my belt. And then the second I opened it, I saw that there wasn't a dead rabbit sitting in the usual spot. It was something else, something wet and fresh looking. I took a closer look on my way to the tower to call it in, and it was clear the pile was made of organ meat. But since I had no idea if it came from an animal or a person, calling it in triggered an immediate and very serious investigation. Hank returned around noon to help, accompanied by another forest ranger who once studied veterinarian medicine before changing career paths and enlisting in the service. And it was her who determined that it was a pile of organs someone had dumped outside my cabin, and that in all likelihood they belonged to either a deer or a moose calf. But that's not what I found so sickening or scary about all of this. It was the fact that the organs, which looked like they'd been torn out of the animal's body cavity, not just cut, consisted of a womb and 2 ovaries, along with various pieces of bloody connective tissues. Now, the lady was completely white in the face as she realized this, not so much what they were, but why they'd been put there. Now, we could safely rule out the possibility of an animal being to blame. I mean, aside from the human footprint, the kind of deliberateness of leaving a womb and ovaries suggested an intelligence way beyond that of anything that moved on 4 legs. But it's what it said, what it suggested, that had the 3 of us turning pale as the lady turned over the pieces of wet flesh, examined them, and then identified them. Hank once again asked if I wanted to throw in the towel, and while these days I'm quite certain that I'd hop on that helicopter without a second thought, back then, things were different. You can call me all kinds of stupid in the comments or whatever, I don't mind. Lord knows that I've said it to myself what must be hundreds of times already, but in the moment, what I felt way more than any fear, which was already a lot, was anger. Like, how freaking far did I have to go to get away from psycho men? The Amazon? The Arctic? The mother-effing moon? Like, all necessary caveats aside, not all men and all that positive stuff, but back then, stood outside the cabin with the smell of those organs in my nose. I remember shaking more out of anger than fright. I spent the last 6 or 7 years letting some a-hole run me into the ground. From my old bosses to my ex-boyfriend, they made my life hell. One of the promises I made myself after moving back to Montana was that I was never going to let anything like that ever happen again. So if I wasn't going to draw a line in the sand right there, then where the F was I going to draw it? I guess that might sound kinda bat crap crazy, as they say to some people. I sure as heck sounded crazy to me, having just typed it out and revisited that part of myself in my mind, but at the time, that's just how I felt, especially after the little game of swapsies me and Hank played before he and the would-be vet departed. Hank said that he figured I might refuse to leave. I'd been so steadfast in the face of that footprint, so he had no reason to believe that that deer entrails was going to do any different. But since he very much needed to retrieve his service pistol, he brought me a little gift with which to defend myself, and when I saw it, my eyes lit up. Being a country girl, I'd grown up around guns, but I didn't have a lot of experience with things like shotguns or pistols. But what I had done a lot of with my big brother when we were kids was shoot my dad's old .22 out in the woods. Now, he took us out around July 4th every year for about 4 or 5 years. So while I was only mildly comfortable preparing Hank's pistol to fire, I was very comfortable with that .22 in my grip. He said that he'd check it out of the armory on the pretense of some bear sightings, citing the rabbits and the entrails that had been found near my cabin. and there was no way that he couldn't have written anything about a person, not without getting the attention of some higher-ups and potentially slowing the process of getting me what I needed. Now, I was grateful beyond belief, and I'm still grateful for everything Hank did for me, but as you can imagine, despite all my bravado, it still wasn't enough to keep me sleeping easy. Cue all the horror movie cliches here about every gust of wind and twig snap waking me up, but it's true, and I'm not ashamed to say that 22 or not, I was terrified, and I stopped feeling safe in the cabin altogether, knowing that if someone broke inside while I was asleep, I'd have to try and operate that gun while half asleep and in pitch darkness with my heart pounding. And then if they chose to break through the window of my cabin, it could be right there in front of me before I even knew what was happening, which, as all the gun freaks in the comments will agree with me, it is not ideal in a long gun situation. And that, boys and girls, is how I decided to start sleeping in the watchtower. I dragged the cabin's old mattress all the way up there one afternoon before laying it down on the wooden floor. The interior of the tower was so small the mattress barely fit, and it was also way more exposed to bugs thanks to the little ventilation gaps in what was otherwise a watertight roof. But I could lock the gate on the fence around the bottom, and I'd hear loud and clear if anyone came up the stairs at night, and in the event that that happened, I had the radio right there in front of me if it did. And so all in all, it felt a heck of a lot safer than that freaking cabin, where even if you did lock the front door, it felt like it'd break open if you leaned on the damn thing too hard. It was the right move too, but I knew it was, and I just didn't think that it'd fail to fully protect me in the way that it did. One night, I'm asleep in the tower sharing a mattress with the gun when I wake up to this strange sort of squealing sound. Like most sounds I heard during the night, this one had me awake and reaching for the rifle. But usually speaking, there'd be this moment of it was just the wind, or it was probably just some animal, because then 5 to 10 minutes would pass without a vent and I'd just end up drifting off to sleep again. But on this occasion, I could tell right away that something was wrong, because this wasn't some natural sound that I was hearing. It was metallic. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest, that sort of da-dum, 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 all while I could hear this sort of keening, stretching sound, followed by a sudden snap, and then I suddenly realized what I was listening to. Someone, or something, had just ripped open the chain-link fence at the bottom of the tower. And what followed was one of the strangest and most frightening experiences of my entire life. Because while every fiber of my being was screaming at me to get up and get ready to fight, I couldn't bring myself to move a single muscle. I could barely even bring myself to breathe, and I realized my breathing in general is so shallow that I was in danger of hyperventilating and shutting down completely. But still, all I could do was lay there on the mattress, trembling and every muscle tensed up as I heard these faint, slow but heavy footsteps before they suddenly got loud as a foot hit the metal stairs. The first one hit like a dun, and it was so heavy that I swear that I could feel the vibration of it coming right up the tower, but still I couldn't bring myself to do a single thing other than lay there, gripping the rifle and just sort of hoping it'd stop on its own. And then a thought hit me, and it hit hard. If I wanted to stop, if I wanted to save myself, then I was going to have to do something about it personally. I thought about my ex and about the dead rabbits and then the ovaries, and suddenly, finding my feet wasn't so hard anymore. The footsteps on the stairs stopped once my own started echoing around the tower. I've been scared that they might speed up as whoever it was rushed to confront me, but thankfully they didn't. I stepped out onto the catwalk, loudly charging the rifle before I stepped toward the stairs and aimed it towards their top. Then, in a loud voice, I told whoever was climbing them that while I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, I could guarantee that anyone who climbed to the top of my tower was going to get shot. Silence followed. No footsteps, no talking, no nothing. I don't know how long I lasted in that silence, but in the end, I broke by asking if whoever was there had heard me. I don't know what the hell I was expecting. It wasn't like whoever was there was ever going to be like, "Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am." But when that silence held, when I didn't get so much as a grunt in response, somehow the fear that I felt got 10 times worse. It occurred to me that I might not be dealing with someone who wouldn't talk, but rather someone who couldn't, and that had me way more frightened than I had been before. I remember the exact moment I thought to myself, if he won't talk to me, I'll let the rifle do the talking, because nothing gets the point across like a warning shot, right? And so that's what I did. I quickly pointed the rifle toward the sky and pulled the trigger. The flash and the shot were so much brighter and louder at night and under that woodwork, and I guess that worked for my advantage too, because after screaming out the question of, "Do you understand me?" while my ears were ringing, I eventually started to hear feet on the stairs again. Only this time, instead of going upward and further towards me, they went down and away from me. Now, I was shaking so hard that by the time the person touched the ground again, I'm surprised that the whole watchtower wasn't vibrating. Part of me wanted to look down so I could maybe catch a glimpse at whatever had been stalking me, but once again my body froze up. I could already hear whoever it was moving away from the tower, and it was so quiet that I couldn't hear those bare footsteps against the dirt, and it seemed like the encounter was so close to being over that the last thing I wanted to do was do anything that might prolong it. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I barely slept for the next 2 weeks, actually. Hank and another ranger came up to take a look around, as well as take an official statement from me regarding what happened that night. Our visitor never showed his face again, and thankfully, that halfway walk up the stairs was the last interaction we ever had. But like I said, it still took me weeks before I was able to sleep properly again, and even longer before I was able to move back into the cabin and enjoy all that additional comfort and coolness. The glass box of that tower was like a freaking greenhouse sometimes. Now, I've forgotten a lot of things over the years, and even things that were once precious to me have faded into the background, but I've never forgotten how scared I was, and more importantly, how stupid I was in putting my own life in danger just to prove a point. The world's a cruel place, ladies, and it's full of cruel people too, but not a single one of them is worth risking your health for. The only people worth dying for are the ones we love, and it's our job to make it home in one piece, so we can spend as much time with them as possible. During the summer of 2011, I've been working for the U.S. Forest Service for coming up on 15 years, and for the past 4 summers, I'd spent my days as a fire lookout, living in some box on a mountain. I'd look out for smoke, talk to myself or the radio, and learn how to be alone for such long periods without going completely insane. Now, people think it's romantic. While some parts can be nice, for the most part, it's not. It's just really a job like any other. You get it after you paid your dues on trail crews or fighting fires or doing whatever kind of grunt work the higher-ups kind of throw at you. Now, I started in my late 20s after my marriage fell apart, and I realized that I like trees better than I like most people, especially my dumb bitch ex. The service liked that I didn't complain about the isolation or the pack-outs, so they sent me to different towers over the years. But the one out in the Cascades that summer was my favorite. It had been a dream location of mine for years. I mean, all the lookouts are beautiful in their own little ways, I imagine, but this one out there had everything. Remote, quiet, and the kind of place where the world feels big, and you feel small, but in a good kind of way. And that season started out just like any other. I flew in by a helicopter in late June with my first 2 weeks of supplies. And then after setting up the cabin, I checked the firefinder and cleaned the windows and tested the radio for some peace of mind. Now, the tower sat on a rocky peak about 6,200 feet up, and my living quarters were right below the lookout room. There was a small kitchen, a surprisingly comfy bunk, and a propane fridge, and even a little bookshelf on which former lookouts had left books with little messages in them. And from up there you could see for literally miles. You could stand at the catwalk, seeing these giant ridges folding into valleys and where dark scars from last summer's forest fires were growing back green. I spent my days either scanning and plotting possible smokes or hiking down to the spring for water when the snowmelt slowed. Now you'd hear the occasional bear or elk if you were lucky, and sunsets were incredible. And then nights were for reading some paperbacks and writing or otherwise learning to be at peace with the sound of your own thoughts. Now it might sound funny seeing how similar each station really is, but my time in the Cascades was one of the best that I'd ever spent at a lookout. Now, it was everything I'd hoped for and more, but then I found the pit. It was mid-July and I'd taken a day off of the tower. Something we're allowed now and then if the fire danger is pretty low. I'd hiked a few miles west along an old overgrown trail looking for a spot that I'd heard about from a retired ranger that was supposed to have a good view for personal scouting. As I walked, the trail started to peter out into some brush, but I pushed through until the ground dropped away into a small depression, maybe 20 feet across. Now, at first I thought it was an old mine shaft or a root cellar that had collapsed in on itself after the cabin that had once stood above it had just been moved. And that's when I saw the bones. They were scattered in that shallow pit, like someone had tried to bury them and given up, and the first thing that grabbed my attention was the skull. It lay on its side with the jaw still attached, while the teeth were yellowed but also still intact. And they were clearly human teeth, too, not the big canines of a bear or the flat grinders of some deer or moose. It had incisors, canines, premolars, all indications the skeleton had once belonged to a person. I'd also seen enough animal carcasses in the woods to know the difference. The eye sockets were round and forward-facing, the forehead high and smooth, and I wanted it to be an animal because the implications were so much more tame. But there was no lying to myself. And when it hit me that I was looking at a set of human remains, my stomach completely flipped. I'd done a lot of reading on this stuff in the years since for a ton of different reasons, but mostly because while I was never trained in forensics, I wanted to be sure. That's how I'm certain that the long bones present, things like femurs, tibias, and humeri, were all human and not those of some local animal. One of the femurs I spotted was broken, snapped clean about halfway down like it had taken some hard blow. The pelvis was tilted in the dirt with its distinctive wide bowl shape, and later, when I looked it up, that's how I became certain that the victim was female. For example, in women, the iliac crests are broader, flatter, and set further apart to facilitate childbirth. In males, they are typically higher, narrower, and have a much more pronounced S-shaped curve. Now, the pelvis I saw in the dirt that day matched the exact description and was much wider than the male example I looked up afterwards. Now, the one thing you learn when studying forensics is that the details don't lie, and while I didn't glean these details my own self, I was told that the bones must have been there for at least 10 to 15 years. They had that dry, weathered look and were cracked and almost gray from years of being exposed to the elements. There was obviously no tissue left, meaning that there were no bad smells except damp earth, and enough time had passed so that roots had grown through some of the ribs, which made for one heck of a chilling image, I can assure you. Small animals had gnawed on a few of the ends, but a couple had clearly been trapped down there after feeding, meaning a couple of the smaller animal skeletons were interspersed among the human ones. And as you can imagine, I didn't touch a thing. I just backed up, marked the spot on my GPS, and then hiked back to the tower as fast as I could call it in. The ranger who answered sounded skeptical at first, but when I described the skull, he got very serious then. They sent a team in 2 days after, and when I got the word, I hiked down to meet them at the trailhead before leading them to that pit. Now, I only stayed there for one visit. The crime scene was a few miles from my cabin, too far for me to check every day, and besides, they told me to stay clear while they worked. I watched from the edge as they took photos and measured stuff and sifted through the dirt for anything invisible to the naked eye. One of the state police guys was there in his marked jacket and crew cut, looking at a place among the rangers as they bagged everything carefully. I asked them to keep me updated, and although I kept doing my job as normal over the weeks that followed, my mind was never far from that pit. I pictured someone walking through these woods, maybe lost or hurt and never making it out. Or worse, someone bringing them there on purpose to ensure the final few moments of their life was as horrifying as it was lonely. And the broken femur stuck with me. That didn't happen from a fall, so whatever happened, it was no accident. It seemed to me to be deliberate. Now, a couple of weeks later, a ranger flew in with some supplies and sat me down at my little table in the cabin that I called home. He looked deeply uncomfortable as he told me that after finishing up the analysis of the bones, the lab had come back and said that there was nothing to be alarmed about because the bones were not human. When I was told that they belonged to a bear or maybe a big cat but not a person, I just stared at him in complete disbelief for a second. I just remember stammering out something like, but the skull, those teeth, they were human. And the pelvis, Tim, you can't tell me that it didn't belong to a person. But all he could do was shrug and explain that the professional over at the state lab saw things differently. He said that in some cases bones end up getting warped by prolonged exposure to the elements, in which case it was an easy mistake for me to make. But even with all the watertight excuses he'd been given, he still couldn't look me in the eyes for very long. The area was closed off for a week while they did their investigation, but after that it was open to the public again. No more tape, no more forensics. It was wide open again like nothing had ever been found there. Now, I was just a lookout at the time, but I was still entitled to ask for a copy of the report. Yet before I could even file a request, I was told that the whole thing was being handled internally by the state police. I was told that I could talk to the lead state police investigator and that I could get all my answers from him. But the police voicemail I left was never returned, and it was around then that I started to sort of doubt myself a little. Time and time again, I was told that they weren't human remains and that I just simply made a mistake. But I knew what I saw. I'd spent 15 years in the woods, and in that time, I'd found dead deer, dead elk, and even a dead bear one time that had been poached by a couple of heartless bastards, but not a single one of them looked like the skeleton in that pit. The skull had a suture line across the top, and it had human cheekbones, and the mastoid processes behind the ears indicated that it couldn't have even been a primate skeleton. It was as human gets, I think. Now, it wasn't some deformed bear. Bears don't have chins like that, and their skulls slope back, and while I tried at one point, I truly tried to let it go. At night, I'd pictured that broken femur or the way that the arm bones were splayed like the person had tried to protect themselves. And I knew something was deeply wrong with the state's approach to the investigation. I started writing letters, first to the state police and then to my state representative. I kept them simple and factual, describing the location, the date, and what I observed. And I also mentioned the forensic details I remembered and asked them to reopen the investigation and have an independent lab look at the remains. One of the representatives actually wrote me back a polite letter saying that they'd look into it. But after that, nothing. They'd send me a bogus letter to shut me up for a while, then completely failed to act, but instead of giving up, I just wrote more. I contacted the other senator and then the governor's office and kept copies of everything in a folder. Some offices sent back letters while one staffer called me sounding interested. At least until I mentioned the state police had closed it, then the tone changed. It went from, "Oh, we'll do anything we can do to help out," to, "Actually, resources are kind of limited right now, especially with regards to a notoriously difficult wilderness investigation." Now, I was told to be patient, that good things came to those who waited, but by the end of the season, I was told the remains had been destroyed. That's standard procedure for animal bones, so cremating them didn't bat any eyelids up or down the chain. But that's just the thing. They weren't animal bones, yet they were destroyed all the same, like they never mattered to anyone, or whoever they did matter to had an interest in seeing them destroyed. Now that hit me harder than anything because If they were just animal bones, why destroy them before anyone else could check? Why not let a university anthropologist have a look? I think I know why, but laying on my theories just makes me sound nuts. I finished that season, then came down the mountain a changed person. The next year they stationed me at a different tower, but I kept writing. I learned how the system works. You file public record requests and you talk to reporters if they'll listen. Now the ones I talked to responded like I was some kind of crazy lady, but I'm not crazy. I'm just someone who saw something that didn't add up and couldn't let it rest. The state said animal, the bones to me said otherwise, and the fact they destroyed the evidence makes my skin crawl even today. I still scan the ridges in my mind sometimes, even though I'm retired now. I still write the occasional letter when a new representative gets elected. Most people think I'm chasing ghosts, and maybe I am, but I stood over that pit and looked into the empty eye sockets that once held a person's eyes, and I made a promise to try and get to the bottom of it. Everyone knows that the woods have their secrets. I just didn't know that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us help those secrets stay buried. The system moved on, but I remember. Every quiet night in my cabin, I remember the bones. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. I'd love to see you there. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel. It's called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, it ended with a womp womp.